Your parents are your problem, Evelyn. My money is mine and your money is yours. Do not expect me to drain my hard-earned savings for that old man. My husband Julian slammed his laptop shut, looking at me with absolute disgust. Sitting on my custom velvet sofa, his mother Brenda took a slow sip of her chardonnay and nodded in agreement. I stood there holding my father's $15,000 medical bill and felt something inside me snap. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply smiled and agreed to his terms. What Julian did not know was that the luxury lifestyle he bragged about was entirely funded by me, to the tune of $8,700 a month. That night, I logged into my business accounts and cut them off completely. 30 days later, his entire family was in a blind panic. Before I share how I dismantled his fake empire piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic partner a lesson they will never forget. The sterile scent of bleach and rubbing alcohol still clung to my clothes when I walked through the front door of our home that Tuesday evening. My father David had suffered a mild stroke just 48 hours prior. He was the strongest man I knew. He was a man who had worked double shifts at the City Transit Authority for 30 years to make sure I could attend college without ever drowning in student loans. Seeing him lying in that hospital bed looking so frail and vulnerable had completely shattered my heart. The doctors had stabilized him, but the reality of his recovery was grim. He needed intensive care at a premier rehabilitation facility to regain his mobility and his speech. The cost was staggering. $15,000 out of pocket just to secure his admission and start the program immediately. I had driven home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I needed to talk to my husband Julian. We had been married for 5 years, and I genuinely believed that in times of crisis, a marriage was supposed to be a partnership. I found Julian in the living room sitting in his favorite leather recliner, the one I had custom ordered for his birthday last year. He was typing aggressively on his laptop, supposedly closing a major sales deal. I stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering my thoughts and trying to steady my breathing. Julian, I started, my voice trembling slightly. The doctors came in today. Dad is stable, but he needs to go to the Oakwood Rehabilitation Center. It is going to cost $15,000 up front. I need us to figure out how to cover this together. I was asking him to step up to be the supportive partner I desperately needed in the darkest moment of my life. Julian did not even look up from his screen. He kept typing, his jaw set in a rigid line. "Julian, did you hear me?" I asked, stepping closer to the chair. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and aggressively slammed his laptop shut. The sharp crack of the plastic echoed in the quiet room, making me flinch. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were completely devoid of empathy. "Your parents, your problem, Evelyn," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I stared at him, unable to process the cruelty of his words. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "He is my father, Julian. We are supposed to be a team. We are a team when it comes to our household," he replied, leaning back and crossing his arms. "But my money is mine, and your money is yours. That was the agreement. Do not expect me to drain my hard-earned savings for that old man. He should have planned his retirement better." The sheer audacity of his statement left me breathless. He spoke about my father, a man who had treated Julian like his own son with such absolute disdain. There was no hesitation, no softness, no regret. Just a cold, calculated refusal to help the family he had married into. I was so focused on the absolute betrayal in Julian's eyes that I had completely tuned out the other person in the room. Sitting gracefully on the emerald green velvet sofa opposite Julian was my mother-in-law, Brenda. She had stopped by earlier that afternoon for what she called a casual visit, which usually meant drinking my expensive wine and subtly criticizing my home decor choices. Brenda casually crossed her legs, smoothing the fabric of her designer skirt. She raised her crystal glass to her lips, took a slow, deliberate sip of the imported chardonnay I had bought last weekend, and swallowed with a satisfied sigh. She then looked at me with an expression of performative pity that made my stomach turn. "Julian is absolutely right, Evelyn," she chimed in, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "You really cannot expect my son to shoulder the financial burden of your family emergencies. It simply is not fair to him." I turned to look at her, my mind struggling to grasp the reality of what was happening in my own living room. "Not fair to him," I echoed, my voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rising anger. "My father is in a hospital bed right now, Brenda. He needs medical care to walk again." Brenda placed her wine glass delicately on the marble coffee table. "I understand that it is a difficult situation, dear," she said, adjusting the chunky gold bracelets on her wrist. "But Julian works very hard for his money. He has his own responsibilities to manage. You know perfectly well that Julian has to pay for the family Aspen trip next month. We have had those ski lodge reservations booked since January. It would be incredibly selfish of you to ask him to cancel our family vacation just because your father failed to secure proper health insurance." The sheer entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. She was sitting on a sofa I paid for, drinking wine I bought, defending a son who was currently refusing to help my dying father, all so they could go on a luxury ski trip. She looked at me, not with the compassion a mother should have for a grieving daughter-in-law, but with the annoyance of a woman who felt her upcoming vacation was being threatened. Julian nodded firmly, agreeing with every word his mother said. "You heard her, Evelyn. I have obligations. I cannot just pull $15,000 out of thin air because your family is in a bind. You need to figure this out on your own. Leave my finances out of it." The unified front they presented was sickening. They sat there in their expensive clothes, looking at me like I was a beggar asking for spare change on the street. They felt completely justified in their cruelty, hiding behind the concept of financial boundaries while demanding absolute loyalty and respect from me. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I did not break down in tears. Instead, a strange freezing calm washed over me. I stood there, clutching the folded hospital bill in my hand, and slowly looked around the beautifully decorated living room. My eyes drifted from Brenda's limited edition, quilted leather handbag resting on the side table to the gleaming silver face of the luxury chronograph watch strapped to Julian's wrist. I looked at the imported Italian marble floors, the custom velvet upholstery, the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. They honestly believed they were the masters of this domain. They believed they were the ones generating this incredible wealth. The irony of the situation was so profound it was almost comical. Julian worked as a mid-level sales representative at a regional distribution company. He brought home exactly $60,000 a year before taxes. It was a respectable salary for a single man living modestly, but it certainly did not fund luxury ski trips to Aspen designer watches or custom Italian furniture. What Julian and his mother conveniently ignored, or perhaps had genuinely convinced themselves of in their towering arrogance, was the reality of our financial dynamic. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a national supply chain and logistics firm. A company I had built entirely from the ground up with my own sweat and countless sleepless nights. A company currently valued at over $12 million. When Julian and I got engaged 5 years ago, he was the one who adamantly insisted on a strict prenuptial agreement. He claimed he wanted to protect his future wealth and ensure we maintained independent finances. He wanted to prove he was a modern man who did not need his wife's money. I had happily signed the paperwork, keeping my burgeoning enterprise completely separate from our marital assets. But over the years, as Julian's taste for the finer things grew, his $60,000 salary proved entirely insufficient to keep the peace. And because I loved him, I had quietly set up a recurring corporate draft from my business accounts. Every single month, exactly $8,700 was automatically transferred to a joint trust that Julian used to manage his household contributions and support his family. That money paid the heavy mortgage on Brenda's upscale townhouse. It paid the expensive private school tuition for Julian's nieces. It even paid the commercial lease for the failing tech startup owned by his arrogant brother-in-law Connor. Julian was walking around acting like a financial titan, denying me $15,000 for my father, when I was silently funding his entire existence to the tune of over $100,000 a year. I looked back at Julian, who was now staring at me, waiting for me to break down and beg. He expected me to cry, to plead for his help, to negotiate away my dignity just to save my father. He wanted to feel powerful, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. I took a deep breath, letting the cold reality of my new plan settle into my bones. "You know what, Julian?" I said, my voice dangerously soft and completely steady. "You are absolutely right." I watched a flicker of confusion cross his face. He had expected a massive fight, not immediate surrender. "You have your obligations, and I have mine." I continued, slipping the hospital bill into my purse. "Money changes things, and you are entirely correct that we need to maintain strict financial boundaries. From this moment forward, we will practice total financial independence, just like you wanted." Brenda smiled victoriously, raising her wine glass in a silent toast to her son. "I am glad you are finally seeing reason, Evelyn," she said smoothly. "It is best to keep family drama and finances completely separate." I offered her a bright, empty smile. "Oh, Brenda, you have no idea how separate they are about to be." I turned on my heel and walked out of the living room, leaving them to their arrogant delusions. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom, pulled my overnight bag from the closet, and packed enough clothes for a week. I was going to stay at a hotel near the rehabilitation center so I could be close to my father. I did not say goodbye when I walked out the front door. The drive to the hotel was a blur of adrenaline and sharp, focused purpose. As soon as I checked into my room, I did not turn on the television or unpack my clothes. I sat directly at the small desk, opened my laptop, and connected to the secure company server. I logged into my primary business banking portal. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room, displaying the automated transfers I had set up years ago. I navigated to the recurring payments tab. There it was, the monthly transfer of $8,700 scheduled to execute on the first of every month, the lifeblood of Julian's fake empire. Without a single ounce of hesitation or regret, I moved my cursor over the automated rule. I clicked Edit. Then I clicked Cancel. A small confirmation box popped up asking if I was sure I wanted to terminate this recurring transaction. I smiled, hitting Confirm. The rule vanished from the screen. The financial cord was officially cut. I closed my laptop, feeling lighter than I had in years. The ticking time bomb was set, and all I had to do now was wait 30 days to watch their entire world burn to the ground. The morning sun broke through the hotel curtains, casting a harsh but necessary light on my new reality. I had barely slept, but I did not feel tired. Instead, a crystalline focus possessed me, replacing the grief and confusion from the night before. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect. There would be no tears today, and there would be no bargaining. I left the hotel and drove the familiar route to the headquarters of Vanguard Logistics. Every mile closer to the facility solidified my resolve. I thought about my parents David and Sylvia and the lifetime of sacrifices they had made. My father working double shifts at the transit authority, coming home with aching bones just to ensure I had a stable foundation. My mother stretching every dollar to make sure we never felt poor. They had taught me the value of hard work and genuine love. Comparing their honest struggle to the greedy, entitled behavior of Julian and his mother made my stomach churn. When the massive, sprawling complex of glass and steel came into view, my posture straightened. 10 years ago, Vanguard was nothing more than an ambitious dream, consisting of a single leased freight truck and a folding table in my cramped apartment. I had poured every ounce of my energy, my intellect, and my spirit into building this enterprise. I navigated the grueling, male-dominated world of supply chain logistics as an African-American woman facing constant doubt and endless hurdles. I worked 18-hour days while my friends were out partying, and I sacrificed personal relationships to ensure my business survived the critical early years. But I broke through every single barrier they put in front of me. Today, my company was valued at $12 million. We managed distribution routes across 5 states and employed hundreds of hardworking people. Walking through the soaring atrium lobby, the familiar hum of industry wrapped around me like a protective cloak. The security guards nodded. The front desk, staff beamed with genuine warmth, and the operations directors stepped aside respectfully as I made my way to the executive suite. This was the world I had built with my own hands. This was the reality Julian so casually disrespected, while secretly feeding off its fruits. I settled behind my expansive mahogany desk and immediately called for Harrison, my chief financial officer. Harrison was a brilliant analytical man who managed Vanguard Logistics finances with surgical precision. He entered my office carrying his usual stack of daily briefings, looking ready to discuss our quarterly projections. I asked him to close the door and take a seat. My voice was incredibly calm when I told him that we needed to restructure the personal corporate allocations immediately. I instructed him to completely sever all financial pathways connecting our corporate revenue to the external family trust account. Harrison paused, his pen hovering over his digital tablet. He had always maintained a strict professional boundary regarding my personal expenditures. But I knew the massive outbound transfers to my husband's family had always troubled him from a purely fiscal standpoint. He looked at me carefully and asked if I was certain, noting that an abrupt halt would cause immediate and catastrophic failures on several standing liabilities by the end of the month. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching my fleet of branded trucks rolling out of the distribution bays. I thought about my father struggling to speak in his hospital bed. I thought about Julian slamming his laptop shut, refusing to help the man who had treated him like family. I turned back to Harrison and told him I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. My husband desired complete financial independence, I explained smoothly, and it was my duty as a supportive wife to grant him exactly that. I asked Harrison to bring up the comprehensive ledger for the family trust on the main presentation screen. I wanted to look at every single dollar and trace every single parasitic drain on my life before we permanently closed the valve. The large monitor on my office wall flickered to life, displaying the meticulous spreadsheet Harrison had maintained. Staring at the rows and columns of outbound cash flow was like reading a catalog of my own foolish generosity. Every month, exactly $8,700 was siphoned quietly away from my hard-earned profits to float an entire family of entitled adults. It was a parasite ledger, and reading it now made a cold fury settle deep in my chest. The first significant line item was $3,200 strictly dedicated to Brenda's mortgage. My mother-in-law resided in a stunning luxury townhouse in one of the most prestigious and exclusive neighborhoods in the city. Every Sunday at our church, Brenda would parade around in designer hats and silk suits, loudly bragging to the congregation about how wonderfully her late husband had provided for her and how her brilliant son Julian managed her pristine estate. The reality was a bitter joke. Her late husband had left her drowning in massive debt, and Julian did not have the means to manage a lemonade stand, let alone a luxury estate. My company paid that mortgage every single month so Brenda could maintain her false image of wealthy superiority and look down her nose at my parents who lived modestly but honestly. The second line item burned even worse. $2,500 was automatically routed to a prestigious elite private academy to cover the tuition for Vanessa's 2 children. Vanessa was Julian's younger sister, and she had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. She spent her days hosting lavish luncheons for other stay-at-home mothers and never missed a chance to tell me that I worked too much. She loved to preach about how a real woman should prioritize home and family over aggressive corporate ambition. She played the ultimate traditional mother, completely ignoring the fact that my aggressive corporate ambition was the literal foundation paying for her children's elite education. Without my money, her kids would be attending the underfunded public school down the street. But she treated me like a classless workaholic who simply did not understand the value of family time. But the final major line item was the most infuriating of all. $3,000 went straight to a commercial property management firm for a trendy downtown loft office space. This space belonged to Connor. Connor was Vanessa's arrogant, entitled white husband who called himself a visionary tech founder. His so-called revolutionary startup had not produced a single viable product or a dime of profit in over 3 years. Yet Connor walked into every family barbecue acting like the next big Silicon Valley genius, wearing custom blazers and talking over everyone. He particularly loved to corner me and offer completely unsolicited patronizing advice on how I could optimize my little trucking business. He possessed that specific type of blind audacity where he genuinely believed he was superior to a self-made black woman, despite the absolute fact that my little trucking business was paying the rent for his illusion of success. I remembered the time he told me that building wealth simply required the right mindset and a willingness to grind, completely oblivious to the irony that his entire grind was bankrolled by my checking account. Watching the spreadsheet glow on the screen, I felt the last remaining shreds of guilt evaporate entirely. I had allowed them to treat me like a subordinate, while secretly acting as their primary benefactor, simply to avoid conflict in my marriage. I turned to Harrison and gave the final order. I told him to terminate every single transaction immediately. There would be no warnings, no grace periods, and no severance packages for these emotional vampires. They wanted my money to be mine and their money to be theirs, and I was finally ready to honor that agreement to the absolute letter. The paperwork was digitally signed and sealed within minutes, solidifying the end of their unearned prosperity. The very first tremor of the financial earthquake happened later that same afternoon. I was in the middle of a high-level logistics meeting with my operations team, reviewing our expansion protocols, when my phone vibrated silently against the polished boardroom table. It was an automated push notification from the corporate banking application, directly linked to the secondary reserve card Julian carried in his wallet. I glanced down at the screen and had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud right in front of my staff. Julian was currently at an exclusive upscale boutique liquor store on the affluent side of town. He had just attempted to purchase a $400 bottle of premium aged single malt scotch. I knew exactly what he was doing and exactly who he was trying to impress. Julian had a weekend golf outing planned with his friends and several mid-level managers from his distribution company. His entire personality at these corporate social events revolved around appearing as the wealthiest, most successful man on the green. He loved to casually buy rounds of top-shelf liquor to secure the admiration of his peers and maintain the fragile facade that he was a major corporate player rather than a mid-tier sales representative. I could perfectly visualize the humiliating scene unfolding at the checkout counter at that very moment. Julian standing tall with his chest puffed out, wearing his tailored slacks and expensive golf sunglasses, nonchalantly sliding the sleek metal card across the glass counter. The cashier taking the card and running the chip. The prolonged, awkward silence echoing in the quiet luxury store, followed by the loud, obnoxious beep of the payment terminal. The bright red declined message flashing on the small screen for everyone in line to see. I could vividly imagine the sudden spike of hot embarrassment flooding Julian's chest and the dark flush of humiliation creeping up his neck as the cashier apologetically handed the card back and quietly asked if he had another form of payment. Rather than accepting the harsh reality that his unlimited funding had been officially revoked, Julian's massive ego would immediately seek a more comforting alternative explanation. He would undoubtedly assume it was a simple bank glitch or an annoying security hold triggered by the fraud department because of the unusually high purchase amount. he would chuckle nervously, force a charming smile, and tell the cashier that corporate banking systems were so tedious and overly cautious these days. Then he would casually pull out his own personal credit card to cover the $400 purchase. A personal credit card tied directly to his actual $60,000 a year salary. A card that would rapidly reach its absolute limit if he continued attempting to fund a six-figure lifestyle on a five-figure income. He did not call me to ask about the declined transaction. His stubborn pride simply would not allow him to reach out and admit failure, especially not after the cruel, arrogant speech he had delivered just the night before about absolute financial independence and keeping our money strictly separate. He likely thought the mysterious bank issue would resolve itself automatically by Monday morning when the banking executives returned to work. He had absolutely no concept that the declined bottle of scotch was merely the first tiny crack in the foundation of his fabricated life. The illusion he had built was entirely dependent on my invisible support, and I had just removed the scaffolding without making a single sound. I calmly swiped the banking notification away from my screen and returned my full attention to my executive team. My father was currently resting comfortably at the premier rehabilitation center, receiving the best care money could buy because I had personally written a cashier check to cover his entire stay. Meanwhile, the parasite draining my livelihood had finally been severed. The long game had officially begun, and Julian was walking blindly onto the battlefield, completely unarmed and blissfully unaware of his impending destruction. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp breeze that did nothing to cool the simmering anticipation in my veins. First Baptist Church was the epicenter of social posturing for families like Julian's. It was a place where faith often took a back seat to high fashion and aggressive financial bragging rights. I pulled my sleek black sedan into the crowded parking lot, smoothing down the fabric of my tailored cream midi dress. I had purposefully chosen an outfit that screamed quiet luxury. There were no flashy logos, just impeccable tailoring and expensive fabric that whispered massive success. When I walked through the heavy oak doors, the familiar scent of floral perfume and polished wood greeted me. I spotted my in-laws immediately. They were holding court near the center aisle, exactly where everyone could see them. Brenda was an absolute spectacle. She was wearing a massive custom-made lavender hat, adorned with ridiculous feathers that bobbed every time she nodded her head to the music. She had paired it with a matching silk suit that I knew for an absolute fact cost over $2,000, money that came directly from my corporate business accounts. Julian stood beside her with his chest puffed out, wearing a navy suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. He was actively playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch, shaking hands with the deacons and offering overly loud greetings to the church elders. I slipped into the pew beside them, moving with deliberate grace. Julian barely acknowledged me, offering a stiff nod before returning to his deep conversation with the choir director. Brenda, on the other hand, could not resist the opportunity to perform for her audience. She leaned over her overpowering lavender perfume, momentarily suffocating me, and plastered a look of deep, tragic concern across her meticulously made-up face. "Evelyn, darling," she crooned loudly enough for the 2 rows of congregants in front of us to hear. "Julian told me the heartbreaking news about your father. How is poor David doing?" I felt a hot spike of anger, but I kept my expression perfectly serene. "He is resting comfortably, Brenda," I replied, keeping my voice low and modulated. "The doctors are very optimistic about his recovery at the new rehabilitation facility." Brenda sighed dramatically, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "Well, that is just a blessing. Julian was so terribly worried about you having to shoulder such a heavy financial burden all by yourself. You know how deeply my son cares about providing for his family, but we simply must be wise with our resources. It is such a shame your parents never learned how to properly prepare for their twilight years. Struggling at their age must be so terribly undignified." I slowly reached into my designer clutch and blindly pressed the record button on my phone. Brenda loved the sound of her own voice, and I wanted to capture every single syllable of her monumental arrogance. She continued her loud monologue, entirely unaware that she was cementing her own destruction. I always tell Julian that he works far too hard to let anyone drain his accounts. Brenda preached to the nodding women in the adjacent pew. A man must protect his castle. He is such a strong provider, taking care of his mother and ensuring his wife lives in absolute comfort. I tell you, raising a financially responsible Black man in today's world is my greatest achievement. The absolute irony of her statements almost made me burst into laughter, right there in the sanctuary. Here she was praising the financial responsibility of a man who had his credit card declined for a bottle of scotch just 48 hours ago. She was parading him around as a king when he was nothing more than a jester living in a castle I built. I sat there listening to the choir sing, feeling an intense, profound sense of peace. I recorded every condescending remark, every thinly veiled insult about my hardworking parents, every boastful lie about Julian's imaginary wealth. She called my parents struggling simply because they lived modestly and within their actual means, while she paraded around in stolen luxury. The sermon washed over me, a blur of words about humility and grace, completely lost on the people sitting directly to my left. Julian sat with his arms crossed, occasionally nodding at the pastor's words, playing the part of the devout, successful businessman. When the collection plate was passed around, he grandly dropped in a crisp $100 bill, making sure everyone saw his generosity. He had absolutely no idea that his entire financial foundation had been vaporized. I just sat quietly, maintaining my flawless posture, recording every single moment of their delusional vanity. After the service concluded, the congregation moved to the fellowship hall for the customary post-service tea and socializing. This was the true main event for Brenda and her circle. Coffee was poured, pastries were distributed, and the aggressive networking disguised as casual fellowship began. I stood near the refreshment table, sipping a cup of chamomile tea, observing the room. It did not take long for Connor to find me. Vanessa's husband moved through the crowd of predominantly Black churchgoers with an unwarranted level of absolute confidence. Connor always walked like he owned whatever room he entered, despite never actually paying for the privilege of being there. He approached me wearing a custom-tailored sports coat over a designer t-shirt, the universal uniform of the self-proclaimed tech visionary. "Evelyn," he said, leaning casually against the refreshment table, blocking my path to the exit. "I heard about your dad. Tough break. You holding up okay?" His tone was entirely dismissive, lacking even a fraction of genuine empathy. "I am managing perfectly well, Connor," I answered, offering a tight, polite smile. He chuckled, shaking his head as if I had just said something incredibly naive. "Well, you know how it goes. Life throws curveballs. You just have to hustle harder to stay ahead of the game." Speaking of hustling, my new beta launch is tracking to shatter every metric we projected. We are entering our next funding round, and the venture capitalists are practically begging to throw money at me. It is a revolutionary algorithm, Evelyn. We are going to completely disrupt the local service market. I am looking at a billion-dollar valuation by the end of the fourth quarter. He took a smug sip of his coffee, looking at me expecting awe and validation. Connor loved to use corporate buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. His revolutionary app was a glorified digital calendar that had not secured a single legitimate user in 3 years. Yet here he was lecturing me. "You know Evelyn?" He continued, leaning in closer, lowering his voice in a way that felt incredibly patronizing. "I have been looking at the logistics space lately. Your little trucking business does okay for a boutique operation, but you are thinking way too small. You are missing the macro opportunities. I could run some analytics for you. Introduce you to some real players in the tech space. African American women in business right now. You guys have a great narrative for investors, but you just lack the right mindset for aggressive scaling. You get too bogged down in the day-to-day operations instead of envisioning the global takeover. The sheer volume of his audacity was breathtaking. A white man who had never successfully launched a single profitable venture in his entire life was currently standing in a church basement, attempting to educate a self-made black female multimillionaire on how to achieve the right mindset. He was calling my $12 million national supply chain enterprise a little trucking business while he actively operated his failing startup out of an office space that I personally paid the lease for every single month. The racial and gender microaggressions were layered so thickly into his unsolicited advice that it was a marvel of oblivious privilege. He truly believed his imaginary future success was inherently more valid than my actual verified current wealth. He believed his ideas were worth millions, while my tangible assets were just a cute little hustle. I looked at his smug, satisfied face and felt a deep, powerful surge of satisfaction knowing exactly what was coming for him. I did not interrupt him. I let him ramble on for another 5 minutes, detailing his absurd fantasies about ringing the opening bell at the stock exchange and buying a private jet. I nodded thoughtfully, maintaining steady, unbroken eye contact while I finished my tea. My silence seemed to encourage him, pushing his ego even higher as he assumed I was soaking up his brilliant mentorship. When he finally paused to take a breath, waiting for me to express my profound gratitude for his business coaching, I gently placed my empty teacup on the saucer. The delicate clink of the porcelain seemed incredibly loud in the space between us. "That is a fascinating vision, Connor," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly level. "It takes a very unique kind of confidence to project $1 billion valuation when your foundation is built entirely on air." His smile faltered just a fraction, his brow furrowing slightly as his brain tried to process whether I had just insulted him or complimented him. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. I adjusted the strap of my handbag, preparing to leave. "I mean that aggressive scaling and macro opportunities are wonderful concepts to talk about at church. Social hours," I explained, my eyes locking onto his. "But the real test of a visionary mindset is how you handle the fundamental realities of running a business. Like paying your basic operating expenses." The color drained slightly from his cheeks. He shifted his weight, suddenly looking very uncomfortable in his expensive custom blazer. The commercial rent for his downtown loft office was exactly $4,000 a month. It was due on the 1st. Today was the 3rd. My corporate accounts usually auto-drafted the payment 48 hours prior to the due date, ensuring his landlord was always satisfied before the month even began. But that automatic transfer had been deleted from my servers. His rent was currently bouncing through the banking system like a rubber ball, and he was entirely, completely exposed. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space, just enough to make him instinctively lean back. I looked him up and down, taking in his expensive clothes and his fading, arrogant smile. "I really appreciate the business advice, Connor," I whispered, my tone turning completely ice cold. "I cannot wait to see how you handle this month's overhead." The look of absolute confusion and rising panic that flashed across his face was a masterpiece. His mouth opened to say something, to ask what I meant, to demand an explanation, but I did not give him the chance. I turned my back on him without another word and walked away, leaving him standing alone by the refreshment table, grappling with the sudden, terrifying realization that his entire world was entirely out of his control. I walked across the fellowship hall, passing Julian, who was still laughing loudly with the deacons, and Brenda, who was still preening in her lavender hat. I did not look back as I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the church and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The trap had been perfectly set, the doors were locked, and the fire was already burning. The tension in the house had become a living, breathing entity by Tuesday evening. Julian's personal accounts were bleeding dry at an astonishing rate. The declined $400 bottle of scotch at the liquor store was just the first warning siren of the financial catastrophe that was rapidly approaching his doorstep. His automatic payments for his luxury car lease, his exclusive gym membership, and his country club dues were all hitting his personal checking account simultaneously. An account that now held only a fraction of his usual inflated lifestyle budget because my invisible corporate pipeline had been permanently severed. He was beginning to feel the agonizing squeeze of actual financial responsibility, but his towering ego simply would not allow him to admit that he was drowning. Instead of confronting the reality that he was living far beyond his actual $60,000 salary, his paranoid mind began to construct a completely different narrative. He genuinely convinced himself that the sudden lack of funds in his ecosystem was my fault. He believed that I was somehow siphoning money out of our household to secretly pay for my father's medical expenses. I stood in the master bathroom, letting the scalding hot water from the shower cascade down my back, washing away the stress of the day. The bathroom was filled with thick white steam, but my attention was completely focused on the glowing screen of my phone resting on the marble vanity. Earlier that evening, I had purposefully left my work laptop sitting open on the small mahogany desk in our bedroom. It was bait, and Julian took it without a second of hesitation. My phone had vibrated silently against the marble surface, alerting me via the security application I had installed months ago. The app immediately activated the tiny camera embedded in the bezel of my laptop screen, sending a live high-definition feed directly to my phone. I wiped the condensation from the glass screen and watched my husband completely unravel in real time. Julian was sitting in my desk chair, the blue light from the monitor illuminating the heavy sweat gathering on his forehead. He looked frantic and desperate, his eyes darting toward the closed bathroom door every few seconds to make sure I was still running the water. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he aggressively typed in various combinations, trying to crack my password. He was searching for evidence. He was desperately hunting for a smoking gun, a massive bank transfer, or a hidden medical receipt that would prove I was draining his precious marital funds to save my father. The absolute audacity of his assumptions made me smile a cold, humorless smile. He actually thought he was the primary breadwinner, being robbed by a deceitful wife. He pulled open my desk drawers, rummaging through my neatly organized files, his hands shaking as he tossed my printed mail aside. He was looking for the missing $8,700 that had suddenly vanished from his reality. I watched his chest heave with panicked breaths as another password attempt failed, locking him out of the laptop for 5 minutes. He cursed silently, slamming his fist against the desk in frustration. He felt entitled to my private corporate data, just as he felt entitled to the luxury life I had silently provided for him. I stood under the running water, watching the pathetic display on my phone screen, feeling absolutely zero pity for the man I had married. I let him dig his own grave in the dark. I knew he would never find a single shred of evidence because my substantial wealth was locked safely behind corporate firewalls and advanced encryption that his mid-level sales representative brain could not even begin to comprehend. He was a peasant trying to breach a fortress with a wooden stick. I slowly turned off the shower, wrapped a plush towel around my body, and waited for another 3 minutes just to let him sweat a little longer. By the time I opened the bathroom door, bringing a cloud of steam into the bedroom, Julian was sitting on the edge of the bed pretending to read a sports magazine, his heart still visibly pounding through his designer shirt. I did not say a word about what I had just witnessed. The silence was my greatest weapon, and I was going to let his own paranoia slowly eat him alive from the inside out. The next morning, I drove straight to the hospital to officially discharge my father. I did not take him to the rehabilitation center that Julian had so cruelly refused to help fund. Instead, I drove right past it, heading toward the affluent wooded estates just outside the city limits. I was taking my father to the Silver Pines Recovery Villa, an ultra-exclusive private rehabilitation sanctuary that catered to wealthy executives and professional athletes. It looked absolutely nothing like a hospital. The sprawling estate featured lush manicured gardens, private recovery suites with sunlit floor-to-ceiling windows, and a team of top-tier specialized physical therapists assigned to provide round-the-clock, personalized care. The facility was a testament to the absolute power of true financial independence. I sat in the luxurious administrative office of the villa, sipping sparkling water, while the facility director respectfully slid the comprehensive invoice across the polished glass desk. The cost for a 6-month residency was astronomical, a number that would have sent Julian into a hyperventilating panic attack. I did not even blink. I calmly reached into my designer handbag, pulled out my corporate checkbook, and wrote a cashier check for the entire 6-month stay in advance, paid in full. There would be no agonizing payment plans, no stressful negotiations with insurance companies, and absolutely no begging for scraps from a selfish husband. My father was going to receive the highest standard of care available because I had built an empire capable of protecting the people I loved. My mother, Sylvia, stood in the doorway of my father's new private suite, completely overwhelmed with emotion. The room was beautifully appointed, overlooking a serene private courtyard with a soothing water feature. She clutched her purse to her chest, tears of profound relief streaming down her weathered cheeks. She walked over and wrapped her arms around me, holding me so tightly I could feel her trembling. She asked me how we were possibly managing this incredible expense, her voice thick with worry and gratitude. She looked around the lavish room and quietly asked where Julian was, assuming that as the man of the house, he must have made some massive sacrifice to secure this level of care for his father-in-law. She worried aloud if this financial burden was putting too much strain on his savings, knowing how proud he was of his financial planning. I smiled gently at my mother, reaching out to wipe a tear from her cheek. I squeezed her hands reassuringly and looked deep into her eyes. "You do not need to worry about Julian for a single second," I told her, delivering the line with perfect, serene clarity. "Julian is currently experiencing a financial transition." I assured her that my logistics business was thriving beyond all our previous projections, and that the money paying for this villa came strictly from my own hard work and corporate revenue. She did not need to know the ugly, heartbreaking details of my collapsing marriage just yet. She did not need to carry the heavy burden of knowing that my husband had cruelly abandoned my father in his darkest hour. She just needed to focus entirely on helping my father heal and regain his strength. I left the villa that afternoon feeling a deep, profound sense of accomplishment. My family was safe and completely secure, shielded by the fortress I had built. When I returned home that evening, the atmosphere inside the house was thick and suffocating. The lights in the hallway were off, but I could see the glow of a single lamp coming from the living room. Julian was waiting for me. He was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, holding a half-empty glass of whiskey. The paranoia and financial stress of the past few days had finally boiled over into outright aggression. As soon as I walked through the door, placing my keys on the console table, he launched his desperate attack. He decided to take the offensive, attempting to cover up his own mounting panic and failing bank accounts by projecting his insecurities entirely onto me. He aggressively closed the distance between us, accusing me of being highly secretive and deceptive. His voice was loud and harsh, bouncing off the walls as he demanded to know exactly where I had been all day, and more importantly, how I had managed to pay for my father's medical bills. He puffed out his chest, trying to play the dominant, authoritative husband towering over me in the dimly lit foyer. He told me it was deeply disrespectful to his position as the head of the household for me to make massive unilateral financial moves without consulting him first. He tried his absolute hardest to gaslight me, attempting to twist the narrative so I would feel like the villain. He wanted me to believe that I was the one destroying the trust and transparency in our marriage by keeping secrets about my finances. He was practically shouting now, demanding that I open my accounts and show him exactly what I was hiding behind his back. I stood perfectly still in the foyer, not backing away from his aggressive posture. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or attempt to defend my actions. I looked him dead in the eye and watched the desperate, fearful sweat gleaming on his forehead. I reached into my arsenal and pulled out the exact weapon he had so eagerly handed me just a few days prior. "My money is mine, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, ice-cold whisper. I am just respecting your boundaries. I watched the words strike him like a physical blow. The air seemed to leave his lungs as he recognized his own cruel phrasing being reflected right back into his face. I reminded him with a calm, terrifyingly polite tone that my parents were strictly my problem, just as he had forcefully demanded. I told him he should be incredibly grateful that I was honoring our marital agreement and not burdening his precious hard-earned savings with my family emergencies. The realization that he could no longer bully or manipulate me into submission washed over his features. He was completely disarmed, left standing in the foyer, with his mouth slightly open, grasping for a response that simply did not exist. Because I was not fighting him, I was merely following the exact rules he had so arrogantly established. I turned my back on him and slowly walked up the stairs, leaving him completely trapped in the terrifying empty prison of his own making. I later learned the exact humiliating details of how Vanessa's Saturday brunch unfolded, and the sheer poetry of the moment was almost too perfect to be real. Vanessa was sitting at the premium corner patio table of Le Petit Chateau, a ridiculously overpriced French bistro downtown that catered exclusively to the city's elite. She was surrounded by 4 of her former sorority sisters, all of them dressed in designer weekend wear, clutching crystal flutes of bottomless mimosas. The table was cluttered with silver-tiered trays of imported pastries and expensive avocado toast. Vanessa was completely in her element, holding court and aggressively dominating the conversation. She was loudly detailing the luxurious itinerary for the upcoming family ski trip to Aspen, making absolute certain that every woman at the table understood how wealthy and successful her family was. She bragged about the private ski chalets, the heated floors, and the exclusive dining reservations, effortlessly weaving in the lie that her brilliant brother Julian was funding the entire magnificent vacation because he was such a powerful corporate provider. She loved to perform for her friends, projecting the image of a pampered, affluent woman who never had to worry about a single financial burden. The bistro featured massive floor-to-ceiling windows that opened out onto a pristine valet parking lot, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the guests' luxury vehicles. As Vanessa was in the middle of describing the private snowmobile tours she planned to take, one of her sorority sisters suddenly stopped sipping her mimosa, her eyes widening as she pointed a manicured finger toward the window. Vanessa turned her head, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, expecting to see someone famous or perhaps another friend arriving. Instead, the smug, triumphant smile completely vanished from her face, melting into an expression of absolute sheer terror. A heavy-duty industrial tow truck, painted bright, aggressively visible yellow, was currently backing up with ruthless precision toward her pristine white Range Rover. The valet attendant stood helplessly to the side, holding his wooden podium, checking his clipboard, while the repo man, a burly guy in a high-visibility vest, swiftly and efficiently attached the heavy metal hydraulic hooks directly to the front axle of her beloved luxury SUV. Vanessa dropped her silver fork, letting it clatter loudly against her porcelain plate. She scrambled out of her velvet chair, nearly knocking over her mimosa, and sprinted out of the restaurant in her designer heels. Her sorority sisters watched in stunned, fascinated silence as Vanessa ran into the parking lot, waving her arms frantically and screaming at the top of her lungs for the tow truck driver to stop. She demanded that he release her vehicle immediately, threatening to call the police and claiming it was a massive illegal mistake. The repo man did not even flinch. He calmly finished securing the heavy chains, pulled a thick manila folder from his dashboard, and handed her the official repossession paperwork. He explained loudly enough for the patio diners to hear that the vehicle was officially being repossessed due to 90 days of unpaid lease payments and catastrophic default. The hydraulic lift whined loudly, echoing across the busy downtown avenue as the front wheels of the pristine white Range Rover were hoisted brutally into the air. Vanessa stood completely frozen in the parking lot, her face flushing a deep, horrifying shade of crimson, as dozens of wealthy brunch patrons, including her most judgmental sorority sisters, stared at her public financial execution. Her ultimate status symbol. The very vehicle she used to prove her superiority was dragged unceremoniously out of the parking lot and down the street, leaving her stranded, humiliated, and entirely exposed as a total fraud. Standing in the wake of her shattered social image, Vanessa pulled her phone from her designer purse, her hands shaking violently. Mascara was running down her cheeks as she dialed Julian's number in absolute hysterics. She paced back and forth on the sidewalk, screeching through the receiver, demanding to know why the lease payment had bounced and why her car had just been stolen by the bank right in front of her friends. Julian was currently at home pacing our living room and nursing a mild headache from his golf outing the day before. He was still secretly agonizing over why his own card had declined for that bottle of scotch, unable to shake the lingering feeling of dread. When he answered his phone and heard his sister sobbing uncontrollably about a repo man hauling away her Range Rover, his stomach dropped entirely into his shoes. Vanessa was screaming that she was stranded downtown, that her friends were whispering about her, and that she needed Julian to fix it instantly. Julian's mind immediately scrambled for a comforting rationalization to protect his fragile ego. He desperately tried to calm her down, promising her repeatedly that it was just a ridiculous banking error, a massive glitch in the corporate accounting system of my logistics firm. He assured her with completely unearned confidence that my finance department must have accidentally frozen the family trust drafts during a routine security audit. He promised Vanessa he would handle it immediately and have her luxury car returned before the end of the day. Julian hung up the phone, and his deep embarrassment quickly metastasized into boiling, self-righteous rage. He firmly, genuinely believed that I had made a catastrophic administrative mistake, or that my chief financial officer had incompetently mismanaged the automated transfers. He could not fathom that I had purposefully, deliberately cut the cord. He marched heavily down the hallway, his footsteps pounding aggressively against the hardwood floors, heading straight for my home office. He burst through the heavy oak double doors, without knocking, his face red, with completely unearned indignation, ready to play the role of the demanding authoritative husband, correcting his wife's clerical errors. I was sitting peacefully behind my sleek glass desk, wearing a comfortable cashmere sweater, sipping a cup of hot green tea. The sunlight streamed through the plantation shutters, casting a warm glow over the pristine, organized space. My dual monitors displayed real-time tracking of my national freight routes, a visual representation of my massive, thriving empire. The contrast between my absolute serenity and his chaotic, aggressive panic was beautifully stark. Julian stormed up to my desk, slapping his hands down flat on the glass surface, leaning over to intimidate me. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide and frantic. He completely bypassed any polite greeting and immediately launched into a harsh, demanding tirade. He ordered me to log into my banking portal right this second and fix whatever massive glitch my incompetent accountants had caused. He frantically explained that Vanessa had just been subjected to the most humiliating experience of her life, that her car had been repossessed in front of her sorority sisters, and that our family was being made to look like broke fools. He demanded that I call the dealership, wire the late funds instantly, and pay whatever exorbitant penalty fees were required to release the vehicle from the impound lot before the sun went down. He spoke to me like I was his disobedient secretary, failing to perform my basic duties, rather than the multimillionaire holding the entire leash to his existence. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I slowly, deliberately moved my hands away from my keyboard and folded them neatly on my lap. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out in the room, wrapping around his neck and pulling tight. Julian's aggressive demands slowly died in his throat as my utter lack of panic or apology began to deeply unsettle him. The red flush of anger on his face started to fade into a pale, sickening shade of dread as he stared into my perfectly calm, unbothered eyes. He waited for me to scramble for my phone, to apologize profusely, to furiously type on my keyboard, to fix his sister's miserable life. But I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I took a slow, calming breath, savoring the quiet victory of this exact moment. Your sister? Your problem? Julian? I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely empty of any sympathy. I repeated his own vicious, heartless words from 30 days ago with absolute perfect clarity, letting them hang suspended in the quiet air between us. I watched his mouth open slightly, his breath hitching as the devastating realization finally began to penetrate his thick skull. He stared at me, his eyes darting frantically, searching my face for any sign that this was a bad joke. I calmly reached for my teacup, took a slow, elegant sip, and placed it back onto the coaster with a soft clink. Why do you not just dip into your own savings account to rescue her from her financial embarrassment? I suggested, tilting my head slightly, feigning polite curiosity. Surely your hard-earned money can cover a simple luxury car lease. You are the provider of your family after all. Julian was left completely speechless. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. The commanding, authoritative posture he had marched in with completely crumbled, melting away until he looked like a terrified, lost little boy. The horrifying reality crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. There was no bank glitch. There was no accounting error. There was no security hold. He realized in that agonizing, terrifying second that the money was truly gone. The invisible corporate pipeline that had funded his entire arrogant identity had been permanently sealed shut. He looked at the dual monitors displaying my thriving $12 million company, and then looked down at his own trembling hands, realizing for the very first time that he had absolutely nothing. He had no power, no leverage, and no access to my wealth. He was completely unarmed and entirely alone. I slowly turned my chair away from him, redirecting my focus back to my spreadsheets, completely dismissing his existence. I did not tell him to leave, but the absolute finality of my silence was a clear dismissal. Julian slowly backed away from my desk, his footsteps heavy and dragging, retreating out of my office and closing the door softly behind him, utterly destroyed by the realization that I had finally truly cut the cord. I later learned the exact humiliating details of how Connor's monumental downfall played out, and the sheer pathetic comedy of it was something I could have never scripted better myself. It was a brisk Thursday morning, and Connor had spent weeks setting up a highly anticipated walkthrough of his downtown loft office space. He had somehow managed to convince two mid-level venture capitalists to meet him on site to discuss a potential seed funding round for his imaginary revolutionary application. Connor had spent his entire morning preparing for this exact moment, grooming his facial hair to achieve the perfect careless startup founder look, and purchasing 3 overpriced artisanal matcha lattes for himself and his guests. He met the two investors in the lobby of the trendy exposed brick building, speaking loudly and confidently about his user acquisition strategies and his massive projected revenue models. He was putting on the absolute performance of his life, leading these two wealthy businessmen up the modern floating staircase toward Suite 402. His chest was puffed out with unearned pride as he gestured broadly, talking about how he had specifically chosen this expensive creative workspace to foster innovation and disrupt the local service market. He rounded the corner of the 4th-floor hallway, expecting to walk up to his sleek, frosted glass doors and welcome the investors into his domain. Instead, he stopped so abruptly that the hot green matcha spilled over the edge of his paper cup and scalded his wrist. There, resting heavy and cold against the polished metal handles of his office, was a thick industrial chain secured by a massive iron padlock, and taped squarely at eye level right in the center of the beautiful frosted glass was a bright neon orange legal notice. Connor stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open as his eyes scanned the bold black letters of the eviction notice. It explicitly detailed that the commercial lease had gone into catastrophic default due to unpaid rent totaling over $4,000. The legal document completely laid bare the humiliating truth that the visionary founder standing before them did not even possess the basic capital to keep the lights on in his own workspace. The two venture capitalists stopped a few feet behind him, the silence in the hallway turning incredibly heavy and profoundly awkward. They looked at the heavy iron chains, then looked at the bright orange eviction notice, and finally looked at Connor, whose face was rapidly draining of all color. Connor began to stammer desperately, trying to recover his footing. He let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh and frantically tried to explain that it was just a ridiculous administrative error, a simple banking glitch caused by his finance team transitioning to a new corporate account. He aggressively patted his pockets, pretending to look for his phone to call his imaginary property manager. But the investors were not foolish. They recognized the desperate, panicked stench of a complete fraud when they saw one. They did not say a word. They simply exchanged a highly uncomfortable, knowing glance, slowly backed away from the padlocked doors, and walked straight back to the elevator, leaving Connor standing entirely alone in the empty hallway, holding his overpriced coffee and staring at the locked gates of his shattered illusion. The absolute humiliation of being exposed as a penniless fraud in front of major investors completely broke Connor's fragile mind. His towering ego simply could not process the fact that he was responsible for his own failure, so his brain violently rejected the reality and immediately sought a target to blame. He left the building and drove his car erratically across town, heading straight for the suburbs. He was entirely consumed by a blinding, self-righteous rage, and he directed every single ounce of that fury directly at Julian. I was sitting quietly in my home office reviewing quarterly reports when I heard the violent slam of the front door echoing through the foyer. Connor did not knock, and he did not wait to be invited inside. He barged into my home like a wild animal. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, and his expensive custom blazer completely rumpled. Julian had been sitting on the living room sofa nursing a mild headache and trying to figure out how he was going to survive the month when Connor marched right up to him. I stepped out of my office and stood quietly at the top of the sweeping wooden staircase, looking down at the beautiful disaster unfolding in my living room. Connor did not even acknowledge my presence. He stood over Julian, pointing a shaking finger directly at his face, and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know why his commercial rent had not been paid, and why he had just been subjected to the most deeply humiliating moment of his entire professional career. Julian stood up, his own face tightening with defensive anger, trying to calmly tell Connor to lower his voice in his house. But Connor was completely unhinged. The polite progressive mask he usually wore at family dinners completely melted away, revealing the ugly entitled prejudice that had always lurked just beneath his skin. He laughed a harsh, cruel laugh and looked Julian up and down with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "What house?" Connor spat, his voice dripping with venomous mockery. "You do not own anything, Julian. You are nothing but a pathetic broke fraud playing dress-up. You walk around here acting like some powerful provider, some big corporate player, but you cannot even keep the damn lights on." Julian stepped forward, trying to defend his shattered pride, but Connor completely cut him off. The deep-seated toxic entitlement of Connor's privilege fully leaked out as he began to attack Julian's manhood. Connor screamed that Julian was weak and useless, demanding to know why Julian could not simply control his own wife. He yelled that it was Julian's job to keep me in line and forced me to open my checkbook. Connor stood there in the middle of a home, completely funded and owned by a successful black woman, and genuinely expressed his absolute outrage that the black man standing in front of him had failed to properly extract my wealth to serve Connor's needs. He spoke about my money as if it was his inherent birthright, simply waiting to be managed by the men in the family. He hurled insults at Julian, calling him a spineless weakling who let a woman run the show and ruin their family operations. The sheer audacity of his rant was breathtaking. Connor completely ignored his own massive failures, his own inability to generate a single dollar of profit, and instead blamed Julian for failing to properly subjugate me and steal my assets on his behalf. Julian stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving, but he had absolutely no ammunition to fight back. He could not deny that he was broke, and he could not deny that he had lost complete access to my accounts. He just stood there absorbing the vicious, humiliating verbal beating from a man he had previously considered his equal. The screaming match in the living room was so incredibly loud that it woke Brenda, who had been taking a late morning nap in the guest bedroom. She hurried down the stairs clutching her silk robe, her eyes wide with panic as she tried to play the desperately needed peacemaker. She stepped between the two men, placing her hands on Connor's chest, begging him to calm down and remember that they were a loving Christian family. But the concept of family loyalty had already been incinerated. Before Brenda could even attempt to smooth over the situation, the front door opened again and Vanessa walked in. She had been staying in our guest room ever since her luxury Range Rover was unceremoniously dragged away by the repo man 2 days prior. Vanessa walked into the living room, her eyes red and puffy from crying, and took one look at her husband screaming at her brother. Instead of defending Julian or trying to de-escalate the tension, Vanessa immediately joined the attack. The stress of losing her supreme status symbol had completely eroded her fake polite demeanor. She turned her tear-streaked face toward Julian and started screaming right alongside Connor. She blamed Julian for leaving her stranded downtown. She cried that she was the laughingstock of her sorority circle because her brother had lied about being a wealthy provider. Brenda frantically looked back and forth between her children, pleading with Julian to just fix whatever financial mess he had created to restore the peace. She demanded that Julian step up and be the man of the family and resolve the horrible stress he was causing his sister and brother-in-law. I stood silently at the top of the staircase, resting my hands on the cool wooden banister, watching the entire illusion of their perfect family shatter into a million jagged pieces. Julian was completely surrounded, backed into a corner by the very people he had spent years trying to impress. He looked at Connor, whose face was twisted in racist, entitled disgust. He looked at Vanessa, who was weeping selfish tears over a piece of metal. He looked at his mother, who was aggressively demanding that he magically produce tens of thousands of dollars to save her social standing. In that devastating, agonizing moment, the absolute truth finally crashed down on Julian's shoulders. He looked at the angry, demanding faces of his mother, his sister, and his brother-in-law, and the horrifying realization washed over him. They did not love him. They did not respect his character, his kindness, or his soul. They did not view him as a brilliant leader or a cherished family member. They only respected the invisible atmospheric wealth that surrounded him. They only loved the ATM machine he pretended to be. The very second the cash stopped dispensing their unconditional family love, instantly morphed into vicious, hateful resentment. They were ready to tear him apart and discard him the moment he could no longer serve as their financial shield. Julian stood in the center of the beautiful living room I had paid for, completely paralyzed by the heartbreaking, undeniable fact that his family saw him as nothing more than a broken wallet. He had sacrificed his marriage, his integrity, and his dignity to buy their admiration, and now he was left with absolutely nothing. I watched him slowly sink down onto the velvet sofa, putting his head in his trembling hands as the people he loved most in the world continued to scream at him, demanding money he simply did not have. The symphony of their destruction was loud and chaotic, and I enjoyed every single beautifully tragic note of it. Julian was drowning, and the icy water of financial ruin was rising significantly faster than his massive, fragile ego could ever hope to paddle. The intense screaming match that had completely decimated the peace in our living room had left him feeling entirely isolated and brutally exposed, but the relentless demands pouring in from his mother, his sister, and his loudly prejudiced brother-in-law simply did not stop. They called his phone incessantly, leaving desperate, angry voicemails that demanded he immediately liquidate his vast assets, sell off his imaginary corporate stocks, or do whatever it is that powerful, wealthy men do to produce massive amounts of liquid cash. Brenda was weeping dramatically over the phone about her rapidly approaching mortgage payment and the absolute social devastation of losing her pristine luxury townhouse in front of her judgmental church friends. Vanessa was aggressively threatening to pack up her children and move her entire family into our guest room permanently if Julian did not magically rescue her repossessed luxury vehicle from the downtown impound lot before the weekend. Connor, the spectacular failure of a tech founder, was sending vicious text messages threatening to somehow sue Julian for the catastrophic public failure of his imaginary startup company, completely ignoring his own staggering incompetence. Julian was backed into a suffocating, terrifying corner, and his escalating panic finally overrode whatever tiny shred of common sense he still possessed. He desperately needed a massive, immediate injection of liquid cash to silence his furious family and restore the fabricated throne he had sat upon for 5 years. He looked around the sprawling, beautiful $1.5 million estate we lived in, and his desperate, scrambling mind latched onto the most obvious and fatal solution. He decided to secretly take out a massive second mortgage on what he firmly and arrogantly believed was our shared marital home. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his plan was almost a beautiful thing to witness. He genuinely believed he could simply walk into a major financial institution, leverage the heavy slate roof over my head, and walk out with hundreds of thousands of dollars to feed his parasitic family, all without my knowledge or my consent. He spent the entire night meticulously grooming himself in the guest bathroom, making sure his facial hair was perfectly trimmed and carefully ironing his best-tailored navy suit, preparing to play the role of the wealthy, successful property owner. He scoured the house and gathered what he ignorantly assumed were the necessary property tax documents and utility bills from a drawer, completely ignoring the fact that absolutely none of those official documents actually bore his name. The next morning, while I was sitting at my corporate headquarters, directing a $12 million enterprise and managing a national fleet, Julian drove his leased car to a premium downtown bank branch. He walked through the heavy polished glass doors with his chest puffed out, projecting the supreme, unwavering confidence of a man who owned the entire world. He marched directly to the reception desk and demanded to speak with a senior loan officer, casually and loudly mentioning the prestigious gated neighborhood where we lived, just to ensure he received the absolute best VIP treatment. He was swiftly escorted into a private frosted glass office and offered a bottle of imported sparkling water. Julian sat back in the plush leather chair, crossed his legs with practiced elegance, and smoothly explained to the loan officer that he was looking to aggressively tap into a few $100,000 of his home equity to quickly fund some aggressive new investment opportunities. He smiled his most charming, persuasive sales representative smile, fully expecting the seasoned banker to immediately fawn over his impressive real estate portfolio and hand him a blank check, no questions asked. The senior loan officer, a meticulous and highly experienced professional named Mr. Hendricks, began quietly typing Julian's personal information into the secure banking database. Julian continued to casually ramble, leaning back and talking expansively about the booming real estate market and the extensive luxury renovations he falsely claimed he had personally funded for the property. He talked at length about the imported Italian marble floors, the custom chef kitchen, and the perfectly manicured landscaping, completely unaware that Mr. Hendricks was currently staring at a digital screen that painted a vastly different and incredibly embarrassing financial picture. The steady rhythmic clicking of the keyboard slowly came to a halt. The prolonged silence in the private office grew thick, heavy, and extremely uncomfortable. Mr. Hendricks slowly adjusted his glasses and looked across the polished mahogany desk at Julian. The professional, welcoming smile had completely vanished from the banker's face, replaced by an expression of deep, agonizing, and profound pity. Julian shifted in his seat, his charming, confident facade faltering slightly, as he asked if there was some sort of minor problem with the current appraisal value of the estate. Mr. Hendricks gently folded his hands together on the desk and softly explained that there was absolutely no problem with the property value at all, but there was a catastrophic, insurmountable problem with the applicant sitting in front of him. He turned his monitor slightly so Julian could see the official county property records pulled directly from the public database. Mr. Hendricks calmly and professionally informed Julian that his name was absolutely nowhere on the deed to the $1.5 million estate. The home was owned entirely outright and completely free of any prior mortgages by a private limited liability company, an LLC that was registered solely and exclusively to Evelyn. Julian's face went completely slack, losing all of its color in a single terrifying second. He stared blindly at the bright screen, his brain violently rejecting the undeniable legal reality staring right back at him. He sputtered and protested aggressively, leaning over the desk, arguing loudly that he was legally married to me and therefore he was automatically entitled to 50% of the marital equity, regardless of whose corporate name was stamped on the tedious paperwork. He demanded that the banker factor in his inherent spousal rights under the community property laws, insisting that the bank was making a massive clerical error. But Mr. Hendricks was a thorough man who had already pulled the comprehensive financial profile linked to our marital accounts. He looked at Julian with an almost unbearable amount of secondhand embarrassment radiating from his eyes. He gently reminded Julian of the ironclad prenuptial agreement that was firmly on file with their wealth management division. The very same ruthless prenuptial agreement that Julian himself had aggressively and stubbornly demanded I sign 5 years ago. Julian had been so entirely obsessed with protecting his own imaginary future millions that he had forced his lawyers to draft a brutal document perfectly isolating all premarital assets, business holdings, and corporate entities. The agreement explicitly stated that any property held within my LLC was absolutely untouchable, and that Julian voluntarily waived any and all rights to claim spousal equity in my corporate acquisitions forever. Julian had proudly signed that document on our wedding day, believing he was protecting his pathetic $60,000 salary from a woman he assumed would eventually try to steal from him. He had built a flawless, impenetrable legal fortress to keep me out, and then he had gleefully locked himself outside of it. Mr. Hendricks softly explained that not only did Julian have zero equity in the house to borrow against, but his personal credit profile barely qualified him for a modest personal loan, let alone a massive second mortgage. The banker politely but firmly suggested that Julian return home and discuss the matter with the actual property owner because there was absolutely nothing the bank could do for him. Julian stumbled out of the downtown bank branch, feeling like he had just been repeatedly struck by a massive freight train. The bright afternoon sun felt incredibly harsh and mocking as he blindly navigated his way back to his leased car. His tailored navy suit suddenly felt like a suffocating heavy straitjacket restricting his ability to breathe. He sat entirely alone in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the steering wheel, while a cold, terrifying sweat completely soaked through his expensive dress shirt. The devastating magnitude of his absolute failure finally crushed the very last remaining fragments of his towering, arrogant ego. He had absolutely no money, no equity, no secret reserves, and zero assets to his name. He was a thoroughly broke man, living entirely on the silent grace of a woman he had spent 5 years trying to diminish and control. His phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket, displaying yet another incoming call from his frantic mother, demanding to know if he had secured the funds to save her precious social reputation. He ignored the call, letting it ring into the hollow, suffocating silence of the car. He realized with sickening, terrifying clarity that he could not fight me financially. He could not fight me legally. I held every single card in the deck, and I had built an impenetrable empire that he could not even scratch. His sheer desperation rapidly mutated into a dark, venomous hatred. He realized that if he could not defeat me in the corporate boardroom or the bank, he would have to destroy me in the only arena where he still falsely believed he held any perceived power: the court of public opinion. His twisted, desperate mind formulated a singular, vicious plan. He decided that his only remaining option was to brutally and publicly humiliate me into submission. He resolved to drag my name through the mud in front of our entire religious community and use the sheer weight of social pressure to force me to open my checkbook and restore his fabricated throne. He started the car, his eyes burning with a dangerous, malicious intent, turning his focus entirely toward the highly anticipated upcoming church charity gala, where he would make his final desperate stand. The spectacular delusion that had taken root in Brenda's mind was truly a marvel of psychological self-preservation. Despite the catastrophic financial inferno currently incinerating her family, she absolutely refused to cancel her highly anticipated duties as the head chairwoman of the annual First Baptist Church Charity Gala. This event was the absolute pinnacle of her entire social existence. It was the one night a year where she could parade around in custom couture and pretend to be the undisputed matriarch of local high society. The reality that her luxury townhouse was teetering on the edge of foreclosure, and that her daughter was currently weeping in a guest room over a repossessed vehicle, did not deter her in the slightest. In Brenda's deeply warped reality, appearances were the only currency that actually mattered. She sat at our dining room table sipping cheap wine from a crystal glass, aggressively assuring Julian that the gala was the perfect pressure cooker to force my hand. She genuinely believed that my desire to protect my pristine corporate reputation would easily override my newfound financial boundaries. She told Julian with absolute arrogant certainty that a successful black woman like me would never dare to cause a public scandal in front of the mayor, the city council, and the esteemed church elders. Brenda assumed that if she simply created an environment of immense, overwhelming social expectation, I would quietly and submissively pay the caterers and the venue just to save face for the family name. So instead of scaling back or canceling the lavish event, Brenda doubled down on her delusions of grandeur. She aggressively finalized the orders for towering arrangements of imported white orchids, cascading champagne towers, and a decadent five-course menu prepared by the city's most expensive executive chef. She gleefully handed over a massive deposit check drawn directly from the shared family trust account, completely and willfully, ignoring the devastating fact that the account held absolutely zero funds. Julian stood by, watching his mother write worthless checks, his stomach twisting into agonizing knots of pure terror. But he was too cowardly to stop her. He clung desperately to the same pathetic delusion, hoping that his impending plan to publicly corner me at the gala would somehow miraculously force my corporate accounts back open. They were both marching blindly toward the edge of a massive cliff, entirely convinced that I would throw myself into the abyss to build a bridge for them to walk across. The sheer volume of their shared entitlement was suffocating, but it only made my anticipation for the evening that much more intense. I spent the entire week leading up to the gala, acting perfectly normal, reviewing my logistics contracts and ignoring the heavy, terrified silence that had infected my home. Julian tiptoed around me like a man walking through a minefield, his eyes constantly darting toward my designer handbags and my expensive jewelry, silently calculating exactly how much cash I was currently withholding from his desperate, grasping hands. He tried to play the role of the quiet, reflective husband, hoping to manipulate my emotions before the big night. But I offered him absolutely nothing but a serene blank wall of perfect indifference. The evening of the charity gala finally arrived, wrapping the city in a crisp, elegant twilight. I took my time getting ready in the master suite, indulging in a long, luxurious bath, and hiring a private makeup artist to ensure my presentation was absolutely flawless. I chose a breathtaking emerald green silk gown that draped perfectly across my figure, an understated but undeniably expensive masterpiece that whispered of generational wealth and untouchable power. I paired it with a simple diamond tennis bracelet and matching drop earrings, catching the soft light of the chandelier overhead. When I finally glided down the sweeping wooden staircase, Julian was waiting in the foyer, wearing his rented tuxedo. He looked incredibly pale, a fine layer of nervous sweat already gathering on his forehead. He tried to offer me a charming compliment, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of his impending public ambush. but I simply walked right past him toward the waiting black car. The ride to the grand ballroom was entirely silent, the heavy air in the back seat suffocating him, while I calmly reviewed my business emails. When we pulled up to the glittering entrance of the venue, a flurry of local photographers and church community members were already gathered near the red carpet. The second the valet opened my door, I stepped out and commanded the entire atmosphere. I glided into the magnificent ballroom, dripping in quiet, untouchable luxury. The massive crystal chandeliers illuminated the sprawling space, casting a golden glow over the elegantly dressed attendees. Julian scurried closely behind me, desperately attempting to play the role of the loving, supportive husband for the cameras. He aggressively reached out to place a possessive hand on the small of my back, trying to project the image of a united, powerful couple to the watching congregation. But his palm was incredibly clammy, and his entire body was practically vibrating with raw terror. I smiled radiantly for the flashing cameras, my posture perfect, my demeanor absolutely serene. But my eyes remained completely dark and icy when I looked at him. As we moved through the crowded ballroom, I mingled effortlessly with the city's elite. I gracefully exchanged pleasantries with the mayor, the city council members, and the most prominent business owners in the community. The church elders approached me with deep respect, eagerly asking about the recent expansion of my logistics empire. Julian hovered awkwardly at my elbow, a pathetic accessory desperately trying to insert himself into high-level conversations that he completely lacked the intellect to navigate. Whenever a powerful guest politely turned to Julian and asked how his sales career was progressing, he would stammer and stumble over his words, his face flushing a deep, humiliating shade of red as he tried to inflate his pathetic $60,000 salary into something worthy of the room. It was painfully obvious to everyone watching that I was the undeniable sun in this social solar system, and Julian was nothing more than a tiny, insignificant rock desperately orbiting my massive gravitational pull. He realized with sickening clarity that these people did not respect him for his character or his charm. They only tolerated his presence because he happened to be married to the woman quietly funding the local economy. The heavy, suffocating weight of his own insignificance was crushing him right there on the ballroom floor. But the true nightmare of his evening had not even begun to unfold. The beautiful facade of the evening suddenly and violently cracked about an hour into the cocktail reception. Julian and Brenda were standing near the towering champagne fountain, aggressively networking with the church deacons, when a stern-looking man in a sharp black suit approached them. It was Mr. Harrison, the incredibly strict, no-nonsense general manager of the luxury venue. He politely but firmly asked Julian and Brenda to step away from the crowded ballroom and follow him into a dimly lit private service hallway near the bustling catering kitchens. The moment the heavy acoustic doors closed behind them, cutting off the elegant string music from the main hall, Mr. Harrison's polite customer service demeanor completely vanished. He reached into his breast pocket and slowly pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the massive $25,000 deposit check that Brenda had arrogantly handed over earlier that week. Mr. Harrison held the paper up, his eyes narrowing with deep professional disgust. He bluntly informed them that the bank had just officially returned the check due to catastrophic insufficient funds. Julian's heart completely stopped dead in his chest, all the blood rapidly draining from his face as the terrifying reality of his situation violently crashed down on his shoulders. Brenda immediately puffed up her chest instinctively, resorting to her usual aggressive fake outrage. She loudly gasped, pressing a hand to her pearls, and shrilly demanded to know how the venue dare insult her family, claiming it was obviously a ridiculous automated banking error that her son would swiftly resolve. But Mr. Harrison was an experienced professional who had dealt with wealthy frauds before, and he was absolutely not buying a single second of her pathetic performance. He looked directly at Julian, completely ignoring Brenda's theatrical outrage, and delivered a cold, devastating ultimatum. He stated with absolute, unwavering finality that they had exactly 1 hour to produce a valid electronic wire transfer for the entire $25,000 balance. If the funds were not secured in his corporate account within 60 minutes, he would personally order the catering staff to immediately stop serving food, instruct the audio technicians to cut the music, shut down the entire grand ballroom, and call the local authorities to formally press criminal charges for deliberate check fraud. The heavy, suffocating silence in the service hallway was deafening. Julian felt his knees go completely weak, a wave of intense physical nausea washing over him. He frantically looked back toward the heavy doors leading to the main ballroom, desperately searching for me, praying that I would somehow miraculously walk through those doors and rescue him from his impending criminal destruction. But I was out there standing in the sparkling light, completely unreachable and perfectly secure, while the cold metal jaws of the trap finally and violently snapped shut around his neck. The clock was ticking down the final agonizing minutes of Mr. Harrison's ruthless ultimatum, and Julian was completely out of options. He stumbled out of the dimly lit service hallway, his vision swimming with sheer panic and his chest painfully tight with the terrifying reality of his impending arrest for fraud. He looked across the magnificent grand ballroom at the hundreds of wealthy donors, esteemed church elders, and local politicians laughing and clinking their expensive crystal champagne glasses. He looked over at his mother Brenda, who was aggressively fanning herself and staring at him with wide, desperate eyes, silently demanding that he somehow fix the catastrophic financial mess they had created. And then he looked directly at me. I was standing near the center of the lavish room, perfectly composed, radiating untouchable wealth and absolute serenity. In his twisted, desperate mind, Julian calculated that his only remaining path to survival was to launch a massive public smear campaign against me right there in front of the entire congregation. He genuinely believed that if he humiliated me deeply enough and painted me as a treacherous villain, I would be forced to open my corporate accounts and pay the $25,000 venue balance simply to salvage my pristine public reputation and avoid the scandal. It was the ultimate cowardly play of a deeply desperate and incredibly weak man who had finally run out of runway. Julian smoothed down the lapels of his rented tuxedo, wiped the cold, nervous sweat from his forehead, and marched directly toward the main elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. The live classical string quartet faded into polite silence as he aggressively motioned to the audio technician to hand him the primary microphone. The heavy, sparkling crystal chandeliers cast a bright, illuminating spotlight on him as he stood behind the wooden podium, looking out over the sea of expectant faces. The entire ballroom quieted down, anticipating a deeply moving speech about charity, community, and faith from the man they all falsely believed was the largest financial donor of the evening. Julian gripped the microphone with both hands, his knuckles turning stark white under the immense pressure of his own lies. He bowed his head, taking a long, shaky breath, and when he finally looked up to face the crowd, his eyes were shining with perfectly manufactured tears. He started his speech by warmly welcoming the congregation and thanking the dedicated church elders for their tireless community service throughout the year. His voice wavered perfectly, hitting the exact pitch and tone of a deeply broken, grieving man seeking solace in his faith. He told the silent, captivating ballroom that it had always been his greatest lifelong dream to stand on this prestigious stage tonight and present the church with a massive charitable donation to fully fund their youth outreach programs for the entire coming year. He paused, letting a single heavy crocodile tear roll down his cheek, intentionally catching the bright stage lights for maximum theatrical effect. But then his voice dramatically cracked, and he delivered his incredibly poisonous lie to the audience. He told the crowd that he stood before them tonight not as a wealthy, generous benefactor, but as a completely destroyed and profoundly heartbroken husband. He claimed with absolute unearned conviction that he could not donate a single dollar to the charity tonight because his wife had systematically and maliciously drained every single penny from their joint marital bank accounts. A collective dramatic gasp echoed through the massive ballroom, but Julian did not stop his performance. He leaned closer into the microphone, his voice thick with fake agony, and spun a massive web of absolute fiction. He claimed that he had worked tirelessly day and night, breaking his back and sacrificing his own health to build a massive financial empire to provide a beautiful life for his family and secure their future. He told the horrified church community that he had trusted me implicitly as a good Christian husband, should unconditionally trust his wife, giving me full, unrestricted access to the wealth he alone had generated. Then, he dropped the ultimate bomb, raising a trembling finger and pointing it directly at me in the center of the room. He accused me of secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars behind his back to illegally enrich my parents. He twisted the tragic story of my father's recent stroke, claiming that the sudden medical emergency was just a convenient, manipulative cover story I had used to mask my relentless greed and steal the life savings he had spent years accumulating. He painted himself as the ultimate tragic martyr, a devout, loving provider who had been brutally betrayed by a deceptive, manipulative, and hopelessly ungodly woman. He wept openly into the microphone, begging the entire congregation for their prayers and their gracious forgiveness for failing to meet his financial commitments, claiming he was now completely, entirely broke and facing total ruin strictly because of my deceit. The reaction from the crowded ballroom was immediate and overwhelmingly toxic. The deep-seated mob mentality of the affluent church community instantly ignited, feeding off the dramatic emotional spectacle Julian had just masterfully performed on stage. Total, absolute silence reigned for a fraction of a second before a massive wave of vicious, aggressive whispering swept across the room like a dark tidal wave. Brenda and Vanessa flawlessly executed their supporting roles in Julian's pathetic theater production. The exact moment Julian made his loud accusation, Brenda let out a loud dramatic wail, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead, and actually collapsed backward into a plush velvet dining chair, pretending to faint from the sheer shock of her daughters-in-law. Wicked betrayal. Vanessa immediately rushed to her mother's side, wrapping a highly protective arm around Brenda's, shaking shoulders and glaring visual daggers directly at me. Vanessa began whispering aggressively to the wealthy women clustered tightly around her, loudly lamenting about how their loving family had welcomed me with open arms, and how this cruel betrayal was the ultimate knife in the back. The entire social dynamic of the room shifted violently and instantly against me. The church community, heavily influenced by traditional patriarchal structures and always eager to witness a scandalous downfall, immediately swallowed Julian's fabricated narrative without a single logical question. The older conservative women in the congregation began shaking their heads in deep, profound disapproval, casting intensely judgmental glares in my direction. They leaned their heads together, whispering viciously about how aggressive, career-driven women always lacked proper family values, and how it was a deeply tragic shame that such a good, strong, providing man like Julian had been financially ruined by a treacherous wife. The city council members and local politicians who had been eagerly shaking my hand just moments prior now physically stepped back in disgust, creating a wide, empty, circular perimeter of absolute isolation around me. They looked at my breathtaking emerald green silk gown and the sparkling diamond tennis bracelet on my wrist, and immediately assumed that my quiet, elegant luxury was entirely funded by the money I had supposedly stolen from my weeping husband on the stage. They viewed him as the ultimate blameless victim, a good Christian man brought down by a wicked, selfish woman. I could feel the heavy, suffocating weight of hundreds of angry eyes burning into my skin, stripping away my respectability and labeling me as a greedy, deceitful villain who had mercilessly destroyed her innocent family. The hostility in the air was so incredibly thick, it was almost physically suffocating, and Julian stood on the stage watching the crowd entirely turn on me with a sickening glimmer of triumph shining through his fake dramatic tears. He genuinely believed he had won the war. He firmly believed the crushing weight of public humiliation and communal shame would instantly force me to surrender, to break down in hysterical tears, and immediately run to Mr. Harrison to pay the massive venue bill just to stop the vicious whispering and save whatever was left of my ruined social standing. But Julian had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation of epic proportions. He had based his entire desperate strategy on the deeply flawed assumption that I actually cared about the opinions of these shallow, hypocritical people. He thought I would mentally crumble under the immense pressure of their collective judgment. He had absolutely no idea that I had been patiently waiting for this exact public moment to completely drop the guillotine on his neck. I did not burst into tears. I did not cover my face in profound shame. I did not turn around and run out of the grand ballroom to hide from their glaring, judgmental eyes. Instead, I stood perfectly still in the exact center of that empty, isolated circle, absorbing their palpable hatred with absolute, pristine serenity. I basked in the sheer, glorious predictability of his cowardly move, feeling an intense, powerful surge of cold, satisfying adrenaline wash over my entire body. He had set the grand stage perfectly for his own demise, and now it was finally my turn to perform for the audience. I slowly took a deep, calming breath, smoothly adjusting the delicate thin strap of my designer evening bag, and began to walk. I did not rush, and I certainly did not hesitate. My posture was absolutely flawless, my shoulders pulled back and my head held incredibly high. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of my high heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the cavernous ballroom, cutting cleanly and definitively through the toxic buzzing whispers of the angry congregation. Click, click, click. The sound was entirely methodical and completely unwavering, demanding the absolute silent attention of every single person in the room. As I moved forward, the dense crowd of judgmental churchgoers instinctively parted like the Red Sea, stepping quickly out of my path, as if I was radiating a dangerous electric current. They fully expected me to flee in terror or scream in defensive rage, but my absolute icy calm deeply unsettled their assumptions. I walked with the undeniable commanding authority of a queen slowly approaching the execution block, not as the condemned weeping prisoner, but as the royal executioner ready to swing the heavy axe. I reached the base of the stage and smoothly ascended the carpeted stairs, never once breaking my intense, dark, intimidating eye contact with the man standing behind the podium. Julian watched me approach, and the smug, triumphant glimmer in his eyes instantly evaporated into thin air. His fake crocodile tears completely dried up, replaced by a look of genuine, raw, unadulterated terror. He realized in that agonizing, terrifying second that I was not behaving the way his desperate, pathetic plan required. I was not a humiliated, defeated wife rushing to beg for social mercy and cover his debts. I was a relentless predator closing in on its trapped, helpless prey. Julian's hands began to visibly shake, causing the microphone to emit a low, unpleasant feedback hum across the large venue speakers. He frantically tried to step back to put physical distance between us, but the heavy wooden podium entirely blocked his retreat. I stepped directly into his personal space, entirely invading the bright spotlight that was illuminating his sweaty, terrified face. I did not say a single word to him. I did not offer an explanation, a defensive excuse, or a furious insult. I simply looked deep into his panicking, widening eyes, offering him a small, chillingly beautiful smile, and reached out with my perfectly manicured hand. Smoothly, and with absolute, undeniable dominance, I took the microphone right out of his trembling fingers. I held the microphone loosely in my hand, feeling the smooth, cool metal against my palm. Julian was completely frozen, his eyes wide and terrified, locked onto my face as he waited for the screaming to begin. He expected me to aggressively defend myself, to shout into the microphone, and desperately beg the congregation to believe my side of the story. He wanted a messy emotional screaming match because chaos was the only place where his lies could survive. But I did not say a single word. The heavy, suffocating silence in the massive grand ballroom stretched out for 5 agonizing seconds. The wealthy donors and judgmental church elders leaned forward in their plush velvet chairs, waiting for my desperate defense. Instead of speaking, I slowly turned my head and looked past the sea of angry faces directly toward the elevated audio-visual booth at the very back of the room. I made direct, unbroken eye contact with the lead technician, a young man I had personally met with and compensated extremely handsomely earlier that afternoon. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. The technician immediately went to work, and the bright, glaring spotlights illuminating the main stage suddenly dimmed. A collective murmur of utter confusion rippled through the hundreds of seated guests as the atmosphere in the room shifted from a hostile tribunal to a darkened theater. Behind Julian and me, the massive 50-foot projector screens that were typically reserved for showing emotional charity montages and donation metrics began to slowly hum and descend from the vaulted ceiling. The mechanical whirring sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Julian turned around, his breath hitching in his throat as the glowing white light of the projectors hit the massive canvas. He had absolutely no idea what was happening, but his survival instincts were screaming that he was in terrible, catastrophic danger. I stepped back into the shadows of the stage, letting the towering screens dominate the entire venue. I was not going to argue with a pathological liar, and I was certainly not going to engage in a pathetic public debate with a man who had just tried to destroy my life. I was going to let the raw, undeniable financial data speak for itself. The enormous screens flickered to life, and a collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as a highly detailed, impeccably organized corporate banking statement appeared in high definition. The Vanguard Logistics corporate logo was prominently displayed at the top, completely establishing the source of the immense wealth being projected. Right below it, in massive, bold, black text, was the itemized ledger of the family trust account. The numbers were so incredibly large and crisp that even the elderly women sitting in the very back row could read them with absolute perfect clarity. The screen displayed the automatic monthly withdrawal of exactly $8,700. The congregation stared in total stunned silence as the presentation automatically advanced to the next slide, breaking down exactly where that massive sum of money was being routed every single month. The first massive bullet point displayed $3,200 routed directly to Brenda's luxury townhouse mortgage. Down in the front row, Brenda's dramatic fake fainting spell completely evaporated. She shot up perfectly straight in her velvet chair, her mouth hanging open in sheer unadulterated horror, as she watched her personal financial dependence broadcast to every single prominent socialite she had spent years desperately trying to impress. The second bullet point materialized on the screen, showing $2,500 routed directly to the elite private academy covering the tuition for Vanessa's children. Vanessa, who was sitting right next to her mother, physically recoiled, covering her mouth with both hands as the wealthy sorority sisters she had constantly lied to stared at the screen in absolute shock. The final bullet point dropped onto the screen displaying $3,000 routed to the commercial property management firm for Connor's failing downtown loft office space. Connor was standing near the back of the room holding a glass of champagne, and the moment his name and his unpaid rent flashed on the 50-foot screen, the glass slipped right out of his hand and shattered violently against the hardwood floor. The sound of the breaking glass was the only noise in the entire cavernous room. The people in the crowd began to frantically read the data, their eyes darting back and forth between the massive, undeniable bank statements and the trembling, sweating man standing on the stage. Julian looked like he was going to violently vomit right there on the podium. His legs were physically shaking, and his tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a pathetic Halloween costume. The judgmental church elders who had just been glaring at me with deep, profound disgust were now squinting at the screen, their minds desperately trying to reconcile the tragic weeping provider Julian had just played with the absolute pathetic reality that his entire existence, his mother's home and his sister's lifestyle, were entirely funded by the corporate logistics firm owned by the wife he had just viciously publicly smeared. The dense mob mentality that Julian had so carefully weaponized against me was slowly stalling out and breaking apart as the undeniable crushing weight of the financial truth crashed down on the entire ballroom. Julian looked out at the audience and saw the respect, the admiration, and the sympathy completely draining from their faces, replaced by an intense growing wave of deep, severe communal judgment. He had tried to humiliate me with a fabricated story, but I was currently executing him with the absolute, undeniable truth. I still had not spoken a single syllable into the microphone. The staggering impact of the visual financial presentation was already suffocating Julian, but I was not entirely finished dismantling his fake empire. The massive projector screens displaying the damning bank statements slowly faded into complete blackness, plunging the grand ballroom into a deep, heavy darkness. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. Nobody dared to speak, to cough, or even to move as the tension wrapped around the throats of every single guest in attendance. Julian stood entirely frozen behind the wooden podium, his breathing shallow and rapid, praying desperately that the public humiliation was finally over. He closed his eyes, bracing himself against the podium, hoping the church community would somehow magically forget the financial records they had just consumed. But the true execution was just beginning. The audio technician sitting in the booth at the back of the room pressed the final button on his control console. Suddenly, a sharp, crystal-clear audio file cracked through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers that were strategically mounted in every single corner of the massive venue. The recording was crisp and undeniably authentic, capturing the exact acoustic echo of our living room from exactly 30 days ago. The entire congregation practically stopped breathing as Julian's arrogant, callous voice blasted through the ballroom at maximum volume. "Your parents? Your problem? Evelyn?" The recorded voice of Julian sneered, echoing ruthlessly over the heads of the shocked church elders. "My money is mine and your money is yours. Do not expect me to drain my hard-earned savings for that old man." The sheer visceral cruelty in his recorded tone was absolutely devastating. The man who had just stood on this very stage, weeping theatrical tears and claiming to be a devout, loving Christian provider, was now being broadcast, treating a dying man with supreme, heartless disgust. The crowd sat entirely paralyzed, their eyes wide with profound disbelief as the recording continued to play, trapping Julian in the inescapable cage of his own spoken words. But the audio file did not stop there. The speakers crackled slightly before broadcasting the unmistakable, arrogant voice of Brenda, chiming in from the velvet sofa. "You really cannot expect my son to shoulder the financial burden of your family emergencies," Brenda's recorded voice crooned through the venue speakers, her tone dripping with toxic fake sweetness. "You know perfectly well that Julian has to pay for the family Aspen trip next month. It would be incredibly selfish of you to ask him to cancel our family vacation just because your father failed to secure proper health insurance." The collective gasp that erupted from the hundreds of seated guests was so incredibly loud it sounded like all the oxygen had been simultaneously sucked right out of the room. The wealthy donors, the local politicians, and the strict church deacons physically recoiled in their chairs, staring at Brenda, who was now visibly trembling and attempting to hide her face behind her hands. The absolute staggering hypocrisy of their actions was completely laid bare for the entire community to judge. They had just tried to publicly crucify me for supposedly stealing marital funds to help my sick father. But the recording definitively proved that they had callously refused to help a dying man strictly so they could go on a luxury ski vacation funded by my corporate bank accounts. The devastating impact of the audio playback completely and permanently shattered the false pious image the family had spent decades meticulously building within the church. The judgmental whispers that had been directed at me just minutes prior instantly violently pivoted. The entire room turned their furious, disgusted glares entirely onto Julian, Vanessa, and Brenda. They were no longer looking at a grieving, betrayed husband and his loving family. They were looking at a pathetic group of greedy, heartless parasites who had mercilessly leeched off a successful black woman and then attempted to destroy her when she finally cut off their unearned allowance. Julian covered his face with his trembling hands, taking a stumbling step backward away from the podium, completely and utterly destroyed by the echoing sound of his own cruel voice. The audio recording finally clicked off, leaving the grand ballroom drowning in a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of pure communal shock. The spotlight slowly faded back up, illuminating the stage and casting a bright, relentless glare on Julian's pale, terrified face. I slowly lifted the microphone to my lips, feeling the absolute supreme power of the moment coursing through my veins. When I finally spoke, my voice was incredibly smooth, perfectly level, and completely unbothered by the chaotic emotional wreckage scattered all around me. Julian makes exactly $60,000 a year. I announced, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive silent venue. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics. For 5 long years, I silently and generously funded his entire pathetic illusion of wealth. I personally paid the massive mortgage for his mother's luxury townhouse. I completely funded his sister's elite private school tuition. I paid the commercial lease for his brother-in-law's imaginary startup company. I paused for a brief second, letting the absolute crushing reality of those financial facts sink deep into the minds of the attentive congregation. Julian stood entirely paralyzed, his shoulders completely slumped, possessing absolutely no defense against the brutal, unvarnished truth. He wanted my money to be mine and his money to be his. I continued, my tone turning into smooth, sharp ice, and I simply respected his boundaries. I stopped funding his entire family 30 days ago, and that is the only reason he is standing on this stage tonight, shedding fake tears and telling you all these ridiculous, desperate lies. I looked directly at the crowd, my posture flawless and my expression completely serene. So, to be perfectly clear, I concluded, my voice ringing with total, absolute finality. Tonight the charity officially ends. And tonight I am absolutely not funding this gala. Right on cue, as if perfectly choreographed by the universe itself. The heavy acoustic wooden doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung violently open. Mr. Harrison, the incredibly strict venue manager, marched directly down the center aisle, flanked by 2 massive, burly security guards dressed in dark, tailored suits. His face was a mask of furious professional rage. He completely ignored the silent, shocked congregation and walked straight toward the front of the stage, pointing a demanding finger directly at Julian and Brenda. He loudly demanded that the audio technicians cut off the microphones and halt the entire event immediately, shouting across the silent room that the $25,000 deposit check had completely bounced. Mr. Harrison firmly announced that nobody was eating another bite of food and no music would play until the massive fraudulent debt was paid in full right this very second, or he was immediately calling the local authorities to press criminal charges for deliberate check fraud. The ultimate checkmate had been flawlessly executed, leaving Julian completely trapped, completely broke, and entirely humiliated in front of the very society he had just tried to weaponize against me. The chaotic aftermath of the gala was a symphony of destruction, and Julian was the completely unraveled conductor. The grand ballroom had emptied with terrifying speed, the wealthy donors and judgmental church elders fleeing the scene of his public execution like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Mr. Harrison and his burly security guards stood by the exits, ensuring that Julian and Brenda did not attempt to escape the venue before the police arrived to formally document the bounced $25,000 check. Julian stood near the discarded podium, his tuxedo crumpled and soaked in nervous sweat, his entire fabricated reality reduced to ashes around him. He looked across the massive, empty room at me, his chest heaving with a desperate, venomous rage. He had been entirely stripped of his power, his money, and his social standing, and in his pathetic, fragile mind, the only remaining option was to launch a final aggressive offensive. He completely bypassed any semblance of an apology or a plea for mercy. Instead, he marched toward me, his voice trembling with a mixture of sheer terror and pure malicious entitlement. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at my face and loudly declared that this marriage was completely and entirely over. He sneered, attempting to reclaim some microscopic shred of dominance, and firmly announced that he was immediately filing for divorce. But he did not stop there. He leaned in, his eyes wide and completely unhinged, and promised that he was going to ruthlessly take half of my $12 million logistics empire. He claimed that since we were legally married, my corporate assets were community property, and he was going to absolutely ruin me in court for humiliating him tonight. He genuinely believed that his empty, desperate threat would finally cause the crack in my armor. He assumed that the terrifying prospect of a prolonged, expensive legal battle would force me to negotiate offering him a massive financial settlement just to make him quietly disappear. I stood perfectly still, allowing his pathetic, aggressive threat to echo through the empty, cavernous ballroom. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not back down. I just offered him a small, chillingly beautiful smile, knowing with absolute perfect certainty that the final nail was already resting perfectly above the coffin. "Julian," I said, my voice incredibly smooth and perfectly level, "you are absolutely right. This marriage is over. But you are fundamentally incorrect about everything else." Before Julian could even begin to process my response, a sharp, commanding voice echoed from the shadows near the entrance of the ballroom. A tall, striking woman in a flawless designer suit stepped into the bright light carrying a thick leather briefcase. It was Maxine, my high-powered, incredibly ruthless corporate attorney. Maxine was a legal apex predator, a woman who specialized in completely dismantling arrogant men in the courtroom, and I had paid her a very handsome retainer to personally deliver Julian's execution papers. She walked directly toward Julian, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, radiating an intimidating, undeniable authority. Maxine did not offer a polite greeting. She simply opened her briefcase, pulled out a heavy manila folder, and slammed it aggressively against a nearby catering table, right in front of Julian's pale, sweating face. Maxine looked Julian up and down with an expression of deep, profound professional disgust. She informed him with cold, surgical precision that the divorce papers had already been filed by my office earlier that afternoon. She then tapped the thick folder on the table and gently reminded him of the ironclad, absolutely impenetrable prenuptial agreement he had so arrogantly demanded I sign 5 years ago. She clarified, pointing directly to the highlighted clauses, that not only did the prenup leave Julian with absolutely zero claim to my $12 million company, but it specifically and intentionally completely isolated all of my corporate assets from any potential marital disputes. Julian's face went completely slack, the remaining color draining from his cheeks as the horrifying legal reality crashed down on his shoulders. But Maxine was not finished. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a smooth, dangerous purr, and revealed the brilliant, devastating legal trap I had meticulously set for him over half a decade ago. She pulled out a massive stack of impeccably detailed corporate accounting records, placing them directly under Julian's nose. She calmly explained that the $8,700 I had generously routed to his family every single month for 5 years was never legally classified as a marital gift or a spousal allowance. Maxine smiled a terrifying, predatory smile and revealed that those monthly transfers were formally categorized in my corporate books as callable conditional loans extended from Vanguard Logistics directly to Julian's family trust. And the absolute masterpiece of the entire arrangement, Maxine continued, her voice ringing with total, undeniable finality, was that Julian had blindly electronically signed as the primary legal guarantor for every single one of those corporate loans. She pulled out the digital signature logs, proving definitively that Julian, in his profound laziness and arrogant assumption that he owned my wealth, had never bothered to read the tedious financial documents my office sent him to sign. Maxine tapped the final page of the folder, which boldly displayed a massive, terrifying number. Evelyn is officially suing you for over $500,000 in unpaid corporate debts, Maxine announced, leaving the words hanging suspended in the heavy, silent air. Julian stumbled backward, physically recoiling from the table, as if the manila folder had burst into actual flames. He was entirely checkmated. He had absolutely no money, no assets, no family support, and he was now legally responsible for a $500,000 corporate debt that he would be forced to pay off for the rest of his miserable life. Fast forward a few short, agonizing months, and the entire parasitic structure of Julian's family had violently collapsed, exactly as I knew it would. The absolute second the invisible financial pipeline dried up, the superficial bonds connecting their entitled lives instantly vaporized. Connor, the arrogant, heavily prejudiced tech founder, immediately filed for a ruthless, messy divorce from Vanessa, the moment he realized she no longer possessed a luxury vehicle or a wealthy brother to fund his imaginary empire. He completely abandoned her, refusing to pay a single dime of child support, and immediately latched onto another wealthy, unsuspecting family. Vanessa was forced to pull her children out of the elite private academy and enroll them in the local underfunded public school, her social standing entirely eradicated. Brenda, stripped of her massive monthly allowance and facing immediate aggressive foreclosure on her stunning luxury townhouse, was brutally evicted. She lost her pristine social status within the church community, becoming a complete pariah as the congregation aggressively distanced themselves from the woman who had publicly attempted to execute a massive check fraud scheme. She was forced to pack her designer hats into cardboard boxes and move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the undesirable side of town, her vanity completely shattered by her new grim reality. And Julian. Julian's spectacular downfall was the most profound and poetic justice of all. Completely bankrupted by the massive corporate lawsuit and possessing absolutely no marketable skills beyond his mid-level sales pitch, he was abruptly fired from his distribution company when his aggressive, desperate behavior became too toxic for the office environment. Drowning in crushing debt and facing absolute total ruin, he was eventually forced to take a job as a shift manager at a local fast food chain. His wages were aggressively garnished by my corporate legal team every single month, ensuring that a significant portion of his meager paycheck was automatically routed directly back into my massive, thriving empire. He spent his days wearing a polyester uniform, sweating over a hot grease fryer, his massive, towering ego completely and permanently extinguished. The sweet, intoxicating taste of absolute freedom was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The heavy, suffocating weight of Julian's toxic entitlement and his family's relentless parasitic demands had been entirely lifted from my shoulders. The final scene of this incredible, glorious chapter took place on a breathtaking, sun-drenched afternoon. I was standing on the expansive private terrace of a stunning, gorgeous coastal property I had just purchased overlooking the sparkling, crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. The salty breeze wrapped around me, carrying the scent of absolute total liberation. Sitting at the elegant patio table behind me, laughing warmly and enjoying a beautiful catered brunch, were my parents. My father David was sitting tall and strong, having made a full, remarkable recovery thanks to the intense specialized care at the premier rehabilitation villa. My mother Sylvia was beaming, looking completely relaxed and entirely unburdened by stress. I leaned against the glass railing holding a delicate crystal flute of expensive imported champagne. My phone vibrated softly in the pocket of my custom linen trousers. I pulled it out and glanced down at the bright screen. The notification displayed a new blocked voicemail from Julian. a pathetic, desperate attempt to reach across the massive canyon separating my incredible wealth from his devastating ruin. I did not listen to the message. I did not even pause to consider what desperate, pathetic apology or demand he might be offering. I simply calmly pressed delete, completely erasing his existence from my reality with a single satisfying swipe of my finger. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, raised my crystal glass to the bright blue sky, and turned my face toward the warm, brilliant sun, ready to entirely fully embrace the magnificent independent empire I had built. The most powerful lesson from this story is the undeniable importance of financial independence and setting firm boundaries. When you build your own success, you must protect it from those who view your hard work as their personal bank account. Family and marriage should always be partnerships built on mutual respect and support, not parasitic entitlement. Evelyn's journey teaches us that tolerating disrespect just to keep the peace only enables toxic behavior. True empowerment comes when you stop funding the illusions of people who do not value your sacrifices. Never feel guilty for protecting what you have rightfully earned. Share your own stories of setting financial boundaries and reclaiming your independence in the comments below.